Today's doctrinal theme is on the believer's unity or our identification with Christ. This doctrine is all about the accomplishments of Christ, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, and how those accomplishments are credited to our spiritual account. You see, it's not a question of who we are or what we have attained, but rather the question is whose we are and what Christ has attained on the cross. In Romans chapter 6, the Apostle Paul said, "Consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God through Christ." The Bible assures us that we were born spiritually dead, but now, together with Christ, we have been made alive to God by grace through faith, based on the finished work on the cross and on his glorious resurrection. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul identifies with the death of Christ. He writes, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself up for me." You see, when Paul wrote those words, he was not experiencing the death of Christ, the cross of Christ in his actual experience, but rather that identification with the cross was his spiritual position. The same truth is true of all believers. But Paul goes beyond that. Not only are we identified with his death, but we are identified with his victorious and glorious resurrected life. In chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul says, "Since then you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God." And how is that lofty position attained? Well, he tells us just a few verses later. In verse 3, he says, "For you have died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." Earlier in Colossians, he refers to them as those who were holy and blameless and above reproach. Again, the Colossian believers were not all those wonderful characteristics in their experience necessarily, but rather that was their spiritual position by virtue of their union with Christ. So why is this doctrine so important? Well, it's critical on so many levels. It identifies us with Christ, and it elevates us to a high and lofty standing by virtue of our union with him. But it really also relates to encourage us when we fall and when we stumble into sin. For we tend to hear the enemy, the archenemy of all believers, the devil, who is called in Revelation 12 the accuser of the brethren. We tend to hear his voice when we fall into sin, accusing us and declaring us guilty. But yet, because of our union with Christ and this wonderful doctrine, we can live above that, and his fiery darts will not penetrate our powerful position. So enjoy who you are. Enjoy whose you are. God bless you.